Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Mohammed Zain, and this is my Independent Study Mentorship Spring 2021 project, the use of vein binders by vascular surgeons and phlebotomists. The topic of study that I'll be focusing on throughout this presentation is vein binders slash vein readers. Before we move on and actually start discussing the context of my presentation, let's take a step back and discuss a quick disclaimer. Some of the information in this PowerPoint is from outside sources, and I didn't come up with all the information on my own. Now then, let's get straight into it. What is the independent study career that I chose for the semester? Well, the specific career choice that I chose was a vascular surgeon. A vascular surgeon is typically someone who takes care of arteries and veins throughout the whole body, except the brain and the heart. And typically they'll focus on any vascular diseases, such as blocked arteries or even strokes. Let's now talk about independent study mentorship, the class that allowed me to research vascular surgeons. ISM is an academic advanced course that is designed for students that are wishing to mentor with an adult within a professional chosen career. And with that help of the mentor and the teacher facilitating the class, the student, in that case me, will design a professional college level product. This semester, unfortunately, I wasn't able to acquire a mentor within my chosen career because of code restrictions, but I was still able to contact multiple doctors within the profession chosen so I can ask them for help and advice when I got stuck and to review my product as a whole. Topic that I chose to do most of my research on throughout the semester was vein finders. Vein finders are medical tools that are used by nurses, vascular surgeons, doctors, and other healthcare workers in finding the locations of different veins. And there's a multitude of reasons why I chose this topic. First of all, throughout all of my high school career, I've been mainly focusing on engineering classes and projects. So the medical field is completely new to me. So I wanted to start out with something I'm familiar with. So I decided to do vascular surgeons and specifically focus on vein finders because vein finders will allow me to incorporate my engineering background with the new topic of the medical career and combining them together to make a product that helps me learn about a new career and still have the ability to rely on my old research and old experiences. After choosing my topic and career choice, I started to do fundamental research on both of them and learned many key points about them, like what is a vascular surgeon? More specifically, the fundamentals of being a vascular surgeon and what they have to do on a day-to-day basis. I also learned about why vein finders are helpful. Because even though I know vein finders are used, I need to learn how they specifically help patients and doctors. And lastly, I learned the functionality of vein finders and how vein finders generally work. Because I can't just use a product when I'm a vascular surgeon. I need to understand the ins and outs of it and learn, or is it negatively affecting the patient, and how does it specifically work and light up the veins. Now then, let's talk about our first key point. What are vascular surgeons and what are their fundamentals? Well, the day-to-day life of a vascular surgeon consists of diagnosing, treating, and managing many conditions within arteries and veins. These surgeons specialize in treating a wide range of problems, such as minor vascular issues to life-threatening vascular problems. Some examples of vascular issues that they have to manage and treat are strokes, PADs, AAA, CADs, AVMs, and CLTIs, and multiple others. Now let's move on to our second key point. How are vein finders helpful? Well, in the real world, veins are really hard to find for some individuals. And it gets even harder when that individual has darker skin tone or a higher fat to muscle ratio. So vascular surgeons have to rely on many tools to locate these veins. One such tool is a vein finder. It helps light up those veins so doctors continue to look at it and diagnose treatments. And vein finders aren't just helpful for vascular surgeons. Doctors and nurses can also use vein finders in a variety of ways, such as giving blood work and injecting many vaccines. Lastly, let's talk about our last key point. How do vein finders work? Before I start making my product, which is a vein finder, or before I actually become a vascular surgeon and actually start using it practically, I need to understand the ins and outs of a vein finder and how it actually truly works. Well, vein finders rely on infrared light or near infrared light. They inject infrared light into one's arm or other appendices, which then absorbs the infrared light. Specifically, red blood cells that are oxygenated absorb the infrared light, while deoxygenated blood cells do not absorb the infrared light. These deoxygenated blood cells are the veins. Thus, it highlights the veins by creating multiple shadows within arms or other body parts. Alongside the three key point topics that I learned throughout my semester, I also had three planned research topics to help increase my knowledge on vascular surgeons and vein finders. The first key question that I asked was, what was the history of vein finders and how they came to be? When doing research on this topic, I learned that vein finders were invented pretty recently, in 1999, by an individual called Herb Zeman. He was a biomedical engineer at the time that saw that doctors and nurses were having trouble finding veins for some individuals. So he made a prototype and a final design that worked. Before his invention, many doctors and nurses used the guess and check method of poking needles in your arm or other appendix to see where the veins are, and that can be very painful. The second research topic that I asked was, what's the difference between the many different vein finders that are currently being used? When doing research on this, I learned that there are two main different types of vein finders being used and many variations of it. Those two main finders being portable and non-portable. Many companies have made many variations of it. These companies include Vein-Light, Illusion, and Intravision. These companies have made their own variations and designs of those two types of vein finders. Obviously, portable vein finders are less potent and efficient compared to non-portable vein finders. But since they are portable, they can be used in a more general environment. The last research topic that I focused on was looking at which light source is the best for vein finders overall. For this research question, this was related to my product since I am making a vein finder. When doing this research, I learned that infrared light is the best light source that vein finders use. After all vein finders use infrared light or experimental UV light. And what I found was the exact wavelength that is most efficient is 760 nanometers. This wavelength can be increased or decreased depending on the visibility of your veins or the skin tone or muscle to fat ratio. If you have a darker skin tone, the potency would increase up to 800, and if you have a lighter skin tone, the potency would decrease. But nonetheless, on average, it should be 760. Throughout the semester, I also had two current event assignments. The first current event assignment looked at an article called Compassionate Communication Amid the COVID-19 Pandemic. This article mainly talked about how the doctor-patient relationship drastically changed because of COVID-19. Doctors couldn't see the facial expression of their patients, which caused them to use other methods to communicate with their patients. And doctors were less social with their other coworkers, causing them to have a decrease in mental health state. The second current event article that I looked at was Vein Finder Market to Face Significant Slowdown. This article mainly looked at vein finders and how their innovations and the market itself of vein finders decreased because of COVID-19. Since there's less investors to invest in many studies focusing on vein finders, the productivity and the innovation of vein finders drastically decreased in the last year. Let's talk about my final product. For my final product, I wanted to create my own prototype vein finder. This is because when I was doing research on vascular surgeons and vein finders in general, I learned that medical tools like vein finders can get very expensive very quickly. So I wanted to make my own prototype design that anyone could create in their own house because it's cheap and easy to make, and that's functional. I know my product pales in comparison compared to other professionally made vein finders, but if it's functional, that'll be a win in my book because anyone will be able to use it. The way that I specifically made my vein finder was I first CAD'd a design in Inventor and 3D printed it. I specifically did this because CADing and 3D printing is relatively cheap now, and PLA, the main material that I use to create my vein finder, is reliable and durable. After that, I ordered many parts on eBay and Amazon and soldered all the materials together. The specific wavelength that I used was 640 nm wavelengths. Even though earlier throughout the speech I'd said that 760 is the most optimal wavelength for vein finders, that's if you're using infrared light, which I didn't want to do. This is because infrared light is not visible to human eyes, and I needed to buy extra materials to make it visible, which I didn't want to do. I didn't want to increase the cost of my product, so I decided to use near-infrared LED lights instead. I guessed over and over again with different wavelengths to finally get to the wavelength of 640, which in my opinion was the most optimal near infrared wavelength. After that, I just constructed everything and made my final product. The overall cost of the product was $23.45, which isn't that bad in my opinion. Here's a quick video of the vein finder in action. As you can see, it's very easy to use. Just turn it on and then flash it onto your arm or other body part. It then highlights the vein. As you can see, the shadow in this case would be my vein. And because of the camera, it's very hard to see, but in person, it is very visible in my opinion. Here's another picture on top that shows the vein itself. Now, the specific way that it actually works is that the infrared light penetrates the skin and highlights all the oxygenated blood cells. This is because it reflects off of the oxygen within our hemoglobin, while the deoxygenated blood cells that contains carbon dioxide absorbs almost all the light. In this case, the hemoglobin, which is particularly carrying the carbon dioxide, is the main thing that absorbs it. This causes a shadow to be formed where your vein is and highlights that vein. Alongside my final product and the different research topics I did, I also had 10 mini artifacts or mini products I did. These 10 artifacts were first a phlebotomy slash vascular surgeon vocab list, talking about the different terms that a vascular surgeon slash phlebotomist needs to know. Secondly, I made a schedule on my whole semester and what I did throughout it and what I needed to do. Thirdly, I made a background and medical history timeline that talks about the history of medicine and how it came to be. Fourthly, I made a phlebotomy slash vascular surgeon technique list. This talks about how phlebotomists inject needles into you and the different techniques on how they do that. Fifthly, I made a simulation of my final product. This mainly was a CAD design or a pre-CAD design of my final product before I actually 3D printed it. My sixth artifact that I made was a vascular surgeon autonomy list, which basically showed the different structures of a vascular part of the body and the autonomy of it. This was mainly a fundamental thing that most vein finders know, the vascular autonomy of a body, and was something that I needed to know if I'm doing research on it. For my seventh artifact, I did a different categories of vein finders because I needed to know different categories of vein finders that are currently being used and the different companies that are associated with them. For my eighth artifact, I made a symptom slash treatment chart talking about the different vascular diseases and their treatments for it. For my ninth artifact, I talked about problems and solutions. For this artifact, I mainly talked about how the many problems I had and what I did to resolve them. And lastly, for my 10th artifact, I made a pamphlet slash brochure that basically showed the survey results of a mini survey I did in the middle of the semester to see a mini representation of my product. Here's a few examples of the many artifacts I did. To the far left, you can see my brochure that I did. This took a lot of time and I basically made a survey and conducted a survey talking about different issues related to vascular surgeons and made a whole brochure about it talking about it. In the center, you can see all the different wavelengths that I did research on to discover which wavelength is the most potent and efficient. And on the right, you can see the CAD design that I made. This is before I 3D printed it. It's just to see a visual representation of what my final product would look like. Now then, as we reach the end of my presentation, I just would like to talk about all the many things I learned throughout the semester. I learned in general the fundamentals of the medical field. Like I stated at the beginning, I'm new to the medical field. All throughout my high school career, I've been focusing on engineering, and I'm just happy that I learned about the medical field, more specifically vascular surgeons, because in general that intrigued me. I thought medicalship and becoming a doctor was boring originally, but learning about the intricacies and the complex job of vascular surgeon really engaged me on the topic. I also learned the impacts of COVID-19 on doctors through the current event assignments I did. And lastly, I learned the importance of vein finders. At first, I thought vein finders were useless tools because every time I go to the doctor or get my blood work done, they can easily find my veins and get it done within seconds. But I didn't know many people all throughout the world rely on vein finders to locate their veins. Now then, as I have reached the end of my presentation, I would just like to take a few seconds to thank you for coming and actually evaluating my presentation. I know you took some precious time out of your day to look at my presentation, and I'm very thankful for you doing that. If you have any questions about my presentation, feel free to contact me through my email or the school location of Clearbrook High School. And if you want to look at my Weebly website, which basically goes over everything I talked about in my presentation and more, that's the website link. And lastly, here's my works cited, citing all the pictures I used throughout my presentation and some of the sources I used to cite.